Thorne did not raise his voice. He never had to. The port manager understood this when he saw the two men standing behind Roman in the fluorescent wash of the harbor master's office, their hands folded in front of them, their faces completely still. The port manager's name was Gerald Voss, and he had been skimming from the manifest reconciliation accounts for 11 months. He had taken $43,000 in aggregate, siphoning it through a series of adjustments on inbound cargo invoices that he believed were too small and too routine to attract attention. He was wrong about that. Roman sat across from Gerald at the small metal desk and placed a single sheet of paper between them. The paper was a printout of a spreadsheet, every discrepancy highlighted in yellow. Roman did not point to it or explain it. He simply waited. Gerald looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at Roman. Roman's face gave him nothing. Gerald began to explain, and Roman let him go for about 30 seconds before he said, quietly, "I don't need an explanation." Gerald stopped talking. Roman straightened his jacket, and nodded once to the men behind him. He walked out of the office and down the aluminum stairs to the dock below, and he did not look back. The Seattle waterfront in early November was cold and gray. The cranes on Pier 46 were idle, their lights blinking at the low overcast sky. Roman walked to the edge of the dock and stood there for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, looking across the water toward the container terminal. He could hear the muffled sounds from the office above him. They did not last long. Roman's organization moved about 60% of the commercial freight, coming through 3 of the Port of Seattle's primary container terminals. The arrangement had been in place for 9 years, built through a combination of strategic partnerships with the longshoremen's unions, carefully managed relationships with 4 terminal operations managers, and a series of what the organization's financial structure described as consulting agreements with 2 freight forwarding companies that Roman's people owned through holding companies registered in Delaware. The customs inspection protocols at those 3 terminals were handled through a logistics coordination firm that employed, among others, a retired customs supervisor named Hendricks who processed clearance documentation in ways that created no paper trail worth following. The system ran smoothly because Roman had designed it to run smoothly. He was not a man who tolerated improvisation. He had 2 primary rules. The first was that no one stole from the operation. The second was that the operation stayed within the boundaries he had set for it. Narcotics moved through the terminal network on a controlled basis, in quantities and through channels that Roman personally approved. Stolen goods, cigarettes, counterfeit electronics, and a modest volume of luxury items from Southeast Asia moved through the same infrastructure. Roman had built the operation around the principle that the best criminal enterprise was one that looked, from a distance, exactly like a legitimate business. He hired accountants. He paid taxes on the legitimate revenue. He had a lawyer named Patricia Howe who had never lost a case involving one of Roman's entities, and she understood, without it ever having been stated directly, what her real function was. What Roman did not permit, under any circumstances, was human trafficking. This was not a moral position he advertised. It was an operational directive, stated once when he took over the organization and enforced twice in the years since, both times with finality. The reasoning was practical. Human trafficking drew the kind of federal attention that compromised everything around it. It created victims who talked. It generated emotional responses in law enforcement that were qualitatively different from the responses generated by cargo fraud or narcotics. Roman had watched 2 other Pacific Northwest operations collapse from the inside out because they had allowed that line to be crossed. He had no intention of following them. On a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of November, Roman received a call from a man named Carver, who ran the overnight inspection team at the container yard on Harbor Island. Carver's job was to identify and report irregularities in the manifest documentation for containers scheduled to move through the terminal. He called Roman directly, which he did perhaps 4 or 5 times a year, and only when something could not be handled at his level. Roman was in a car on Elliott Avenue when the call came. He told his driver to turn around. The container in question was a 40-foot refrigerated unit flagged for temperature regulation equipment, listed on the manifest as industrial HVAC components, consigned to a supply company in Tacoma. The supply company existed on paper. Carver had run it before calling. The unit had arrived on a feeder vessel from Vancouver 2 days earlier and had been sitting in the yard pending final clearance. Carver had noticed a discrepancy in the seal numbers during a routine check. Roman arrived at the yard 40 minutes after the call. He came with 4 men. Carver met him at the gate. "How long has it been sitting?" Roman asked. 51 hours, Carver said. "Anyone else been on it?" 2 of Elias's people came through yesterday afternoon. They checked the paperwork, said it was fine. Roman looked at him. "Elias sent people to look at it. They said they were doing a general sweep." "I didn't think anything of it at the time." Roman said nothing. He walked to the container. They cut the seals and pulled the doors open. The interior light was out. Roman's men used flashlights. The smell came out before anything was visible. The smell of confined people and inadequate sanitation and fear. Roman stood at the opening and let his eyes adjust, and then he looked inside. There were 11 people in the container. They had been in there for at least 2 days based on the conditions. Most were seated along the walls on thin mats. 3 were lying down. All of them were adults, though 2 appeared to be adolescents. Their physical condition indicated they had been in the network for some time before the container, not just the voyage. Roman looked at his men. One of them, a man named Tobin who had been with Roman for 7 years, was already stepping back from the doors. His face was expressionless, but his jaw was set. "Who loaded this unit?" Roman asked Carver. "The documentation traces back to a consolidator in Vancouver. I started pulling the thread before I called you. The consolidator is a shell. It routes back through 3 layers, but the 3rd layer has a beneficial ownership connection to a freight broker in Tacoma that I have seen before. It's tied to the same network that runs some of the Elias accounts." Roman stood in front of the open container for another few seconds. Then he turned to Tobin. "Get them out. Get them water. Call Mariana and tell her we need a medical contact." He paused. "The 2 men who came with the paperwork yesterday. Find them." Tobin nodded and moved. Roman walked away from the container and stood between 2 stacks of units 50 feet away, in a space where he could think without being watched. The wind off the water was sharp. He went through what Carver had told him in a methodical way, separating what was confirmed from what was inferred. The connection to Elias's accounts was inferred at this point, but Carver was not someone who speculated without foundation. The fact that Elias's people had inspected the container and cleared it was confirmed. Elias Crane was Roman's underboss. He had been in that position for 6 years. He was 44 years old, controlled 3 of the organization's primary revenue streams, and ran the money laundering operations through a network of car dealerships and restaurant groups in the greater Seattle area. He was efficient, he was loyal in the ways that counted, and Roman had never had a reason to question his judgment on operational matters. Roman had also never extended to him the kind of trust that would make this discovery surprising. He had learned a long time ago not to extend that kind of trust to anyone. He walked back to the container. The captives had been moved to the exterior of the unit, seated along the outside wall in the cold. Roman's men had produced water and a blanket that someone had retrieved from a vehicle. Most of the captives were looking at the ground. A few were watching Roman's men with a wariness that said they did not yet understand whether their situation had changed or simply shifted. Roman moved along the line, not speaking, looking at each person briefly. He was not looking for anything specific. He was simply accounting for them as human beings in a way that was necessary before he could decide what came next. He stopped. At the far end of the line, a woman sat with her back against the container wall and her knees drawn up. She was thin in the way people get thin when they have not been eating regularly for months. Her hair was dark and tangled. She was not looking up because she could not look up. Her eyes were open, but they were not tracking movement. She was blind. Around her neck, on a thin chain, was a locket. It was silver, or had been silver. The heat of some old fire had partially melted the casing, distorting the shape of the floral etching on the front. The chain had been repaired at least twice with what appeared to be wire. Roman looked at the locket for what might have been 5 seconds. To the men around him, it appeared to be nothing. To Roman it was the collapse of 15 years. He knew that locket. He had held it in his hands when he was 22 years old. He had clasped it around a woman's neck in a second. Floor apartment in the Central District on a September evening, the year before everything ended. He had bought it from a vendor at Pike Place Market because she had looked at it through the display glass and said nothing, but had kept looking, and he had noticed. He had gone back the next morning and paid $40 for it, which was money he did not have at the time, and given it to her that night. The woman's name was Elara. He had believed she was dead for 15 years. Roman did not move for a moment. He was aware of Tobin standing a few feet away, watching him with the attentiveness of someone who had learned to read his employer's silences. Roman turned to Tobin and spoke quietly, in the same tone he used for every instruction. "This woman comes with me. No documentation, no records, nothing goes in writing. The car in the north lot, not the usual driver. You drive." He paused. "The other people in the container, work with Mariana. Handle it quietly and handle it well." He looked at Tobin directly. "This conversation did not happen," Tobin said. "Understood." Roman crouched in front of Elara. She reacted to his proximity, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. He did not touch her. "You're going to a safe place," he said. He kept his voice flat and controlled, nothing that she might recognize. "Can you walk?" She turned her face toward his voice. Her expression was not frightened. It was the careful blankness of someone who had learned to suppress fear as a survival mechanism. "Where are you taking me?" "Somewhere warm," he said, "with a door that locks from the inside." She held still for another moment. Then she reached out with one hand, waiting for contact. Roman took it and helped her to her feet. The drive to Roman's penthouse on First Hill took 22 minutes. Roman sat in the back with Elara and did not speak. She sat upright with her hands folded in her lap. Her face turned slightly toward the window, as if following the sound of the city. She did not ask questions. She had learned, Roman suspected, that questions often made things worse. Roman's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building he owned outright through a real estate holding company. The building had 12 residential units below it, all occupied by tenants who kept to themselves, because Roman's property management company had a particular way of screening applicants. The penthouse itself had been designed for security rather than comfort, though comfort had been layered onto it over time. There was a separate residential wing with 3 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom and a keypad lock that could be set from inside. The common areas were monitored by a camera system that Roman could access from his phone. The elevator required a key card. He showed Elara to the smaller of the 3 guest rooms. The bathroom had a walk-in shower with controls that he demonstrated for her, guiding her hands over the fixtures without commentary. He brought her food from the kitchen, basic things that required no explanation. He left her with a set of clothes that he had Tobin source from a women's clothing store nearby, having estimated her size. He locked the building elevator from the penthouse controls so that it required his authorization to operate. Then he went to his study and sat in the dark for a while. Roman had not thought about Elara in years. That was not entirely accurate. He had spent considerable effort, over a considerable period of time, building the mental architecture that made it possible to not think about her. The fire in the Central District in the winter 15 years ago had killed 4 people and injured others. Elara had not been found among the survivors. Her name had not appeared in the hospital records. Roman had looked. He had spent 3 weeks looking, at a time when he was not yet the person he had become, when he still had the capacity to spend 3 weeks doing something with no operational value. He had concluded she was dead. He had built everything that came afterward on that conclusion. The locket had changed the conclusion. He sat in the dark and thought about Elias Crane. The organization had 17 captains across 4 operational areas. Of those, 3 were directly managed by Elias. The freight side of the business ran through a logistics manager named Dmitry Bellin, who reported to Elias. The Vancouver connection that Carver had traced was consistent with a supply chain that Elias's network would have the infrastructure to operate. The fact that Elias's people had come to inspect the container and clear, it was not consistent with them being unaware of its contents. It was consistent with them maintaining operational visibility over a revenue stream that Roman had prohibited. Roman had been the one who established the prohibition. Elias had been present when it was stated. He had not objected. He had nodded once and moved on to the next item on the agenda. Roman had taken that as compliance. It appeared to have been something else. He went to his desk and called Carver. "The 2 men who came to check the container yesterday." Roman said, "Where are they now?" "Tobin's team has them," Carver said. "They're at the yard office. Keep them there. Don't let anyone make calls. I'll send someone in the morning." He paused. "Carver?" "Nothing about today reaches Elias." There was a brief silence. "Understood," Carver said. Roman ended the call. He sat for another few minutes. Then he went to the kitchen, made a cup of coffee, and stood at the window looking at the city below him. He had a meeting with Elias in 2 days to review the quarterly accounting from the restaurant group. He would attend that meeting and say nothing about the container. He would attend it and watch Elias, and he would begin to understand how deep this went. He was not angry. Anger was an emotion that Roman had spent years teaching himself to convert into something more useful. What he felt, standing at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand, was a very precise form of focus. In the morning, Roman went to check on Elara. He knocked on the door of the guest room, and she answered it after a moment, dressed in the clothes he had provided. She had showered. Her hair was combed. She looked in the morning light, like someone who had been beautiful before circumstances had altered her, and who still was, in the way that remains when the surface damage is stripped away. "Are you comfortable?" he asked. He had altered his voice slightly from its natural register, a habit he had developed years ago for situations that required him to be someone other than himself. It was not a dramatic change, just a flattening of certain tones that were distinctive. "I'm warm," she said. "That's more than I've had in a while." She turned her face toward the direction of his voice. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing right now." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have," he said. "Are you hungry?" She was. He made eggs and toast, which was the extent of his cooking, and brought it to the small table in the living area of the guest suite. She ate carefully, without rushing, in the manner of someone who had learned not to trust that the next meal was guaranteed. Roman sat across from her and drank his coffee and said nothing. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted something immediately." "Everyone in that system wanted something immediately." She paused. "You're thinking about something else." "I'm always thinking about something else," he said. She turned her face slightly, as if listening to a frequency he couldn't hear. "How long am I going to be here?" "Until I figure out what comes next." "And what are my options?" Roman looked at her.
"Right now, 1.
"Stay here." She seemed to consider this. "Is the door locked from outside?" "No." "The elevator requires a card." "But that's to keep other people out, not to keep you in." He paused. "There are people who would be looking for you, not for good reasons. Until that changes, the elevator is the safest arrangement." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had a locket when they took me. Silver." "Where is it?" "Still around your neck," Roman said. She reached up and touched it. Something in her face shifted, a very small change, but Roman was watching closely enough to catch it. "I've had it for a long time," she said. "Since before everything?" "Before the fire." He said it without thinking and then wished he hadn't. She went still. "How do you know about the fire?" "I know a lot of things about a lot of people," he said, which was true but not the truth. "You don't have to talk about it." "I don't mind talking about it," she said. "I just don't talk about it with people who might use it." She turned her face toward him again. "Should I trust you?" Roman looked at the locket. The melted edge of it caught the morning light. "No," he said. "Not yet. But I'm not going to hurt you." She seemed to find this more reassuring than a different answer would have been. She picked up her fork and resumed eating. Roman left her shortly after. He had a call with Patricia Howe at 9, and then a series of calls with his terminal managers to begin the quiet process of tracing how long the trafficking operation had been running through his infrastructure without his knowledge. He made these calls from his study, keeping his voice low, though the guest suite was at the other end of the penthouse. By midday he had a partial picture. The operation had been active for approximately 8 months, using 3 different container routes, 2 of which ran through Bellin's logistics network. The third route had come through a different terminal, one managed by a captain named Sorrows who had been Elias's appointment. The revenue, based on what Carver's team was able to reconstruct from the shipping documentation, was between $80,000 and $120,000 per transit, roughly once every 3 weeks. The money was not appearing in any of the accounts Roman could see. It was going somewhere else entirely. He sat with this information for a long time. Then he called his driver and had himself taken to a restaurant in Belltown that he used for meetings when he did not want to be at any of his official locations. He arrived before the other party and sat at a table in the back and ordered water and waited. The other party was a man named Schiff, who worked in the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI's Seattle field office. He and Roman had a relationship that was, From the federal side, officially described as a confidential informant arrangement from a period 9 years earlier, and which had technically been closed. In practice, Roman occasionally passed Schiff information about competitors or enterprises that Roman found problematic, and Schiff occasionally told Roman things that were useful to him. The relationship was understood by both parties to be corrupt. It had persisted because both parties found it useful. "I need to know something," Roman said, when Schiff sat down. "You always need to know something." "Is there a federal investigation currently targeting my operation?" Schiff picked up his water glass. "Why are you asking?" "Because I need to know whether I'm dealing with an internal problem or something that has already gone external." Schiff was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man, which was why Roman had maintained the relationship. "There's been some recent discussion at the field level about expanded review of certain port operations," he said. "Nothing targeted. General scope." "Who initiated the discussion?" "That I don't know." Roman nodded. "If someone inside my structure had been communicating with federal contacts, would you know?" Schiff looked at him. "Not necessarily. It depends on which office and which level." He paused. "Is there something you want me to look for?" "Not yet," Roman said. He put $200 under the edge of his water glass and stood. "When I ask, I'll need the answer quickly." He left the restaurant and sat in the car for a moment before telling his driver where to go next. The meeting with the two men from the container yard took place that evening in a warehouse in Sodo that Roman's organization used for storage. The two men had been kept there since the morning. They were not physically harmed. They were simply contained, with no access to phones, no information about why they were being held, and no contact with anyone outside the room. This was Roman's preference. He had found, over many years, that containment produced better information than coercion. He went in without Tobin. He sat across from the two men, a younger one named Kepler and an older one named West, and he placed a single printed photograph on the table between them. The photograph was of the shipping manifest for the container from Harbor Island, with certain document numbers circled in red. "I want to understand the supply chain," Roman said. "Not the names yet. The logistics. How the units were selected, who coordinated the manifests, how the clearance was handled. Start at the beginning and be specific." Kepler looked at West. West looked at the photograph. They talked for 40 minutes. The picture that emerged was detailed and damning. The operation had its own documentation pathway, separate from Roman's legitimate infrastructure, running through a parallel clearance protocol that West had helped design. The containers moved through the same terminals but on separate manifest sequences that were referenced only at the consolidator level, where the paperwork was managed by a man in Vancouver named Park, who worked for a logistics company that Elias had established 2 years ago using a nominee director. The revenue was collected through a separate cash collection process that bypassed the organization's normal accounting entirely. Roman asked where the money went. West said he did not know directly. He said the cash was collected by a courier, who he knew only by a contact number, and that the number routed to a prepaid phone that changed monthly. Roman asked whether Elias had ever been present at any point in the physical operation. West said he had not been present personally, but that instructions had come through Bellin, who everyone understood was speaking for Elias. Roman asked who else in the organization knew. West named 3 captains. 2 of them were Elias appointments. The third was a man named Caruso who had been with the organization since before Roman took over, which was more concerning. Roman thanked them for the information. He stood and left. He told the men outside to keep them contained for another 48 hours, and then to release them with the clear understanding that they were to leave Seattle and not return. He drove back to the penthouse. Elara was awake when he came in. She was sitting in the living area of the guest suite with the door open, her hands in her lap, listening to the building. Roman paused in the hallway outside the door. "I heard you come in," she said. "I let you sleep." "I wasn't sleeping." She turned her face toward the doorway. "You've been gone most of the day. I have things to manage. Are you going to tell me what you actually do? Or are we going to keep pretending you're just a cautious businessman with an expensive apartment?" Roman leaned against the doorframe. "I'm an organized crime figure who controls a significant portion of Seattle's port logistics. I run extortion networks, I move contraband, and until recently I believed my organization's rules were being followed." She was quiet for a moment. You told me that very easily. You can't do anything with it, and I think you've known what kind of person you were dealing with since the container. Yes, she said. I worked that out quickly. She paused. Why are you keeping me here instead of just putting me somewhere else? He didn't answer that. The fire, she said, after the silence extended. Is that part of why you pulled me out of the container specifically? Roman said. What do you remember about the fire? She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had a particular flatness to it, the tone of someone telling a story that has been told internally many times and has been smoothed down by repetition. I was in an apartment on Denny, second floor. A boy I knew had a room there. I'd been staying there for a few weeks. There was a fire in the stairwell, and by the time I got to the window, the smoke was already bad. I went out the window and fell. She paused. I was in the hospital for a long time. I was alone. I didn't know how to reach anyone who knew me well enough to help. By the time I was discharged, I had lost most of my sight from the smoke and the fall, and I had nowhere to go. She stopped. The boy. Roman, he never came to find me. I thought he was dead. Roman stood in the doorway of the room that had once belonged to a previous tenant, whose name he no longer remembered, looking at the woman he had failed to find 15 years ago, and said nothing. The locket was his, she said. Or he gave it to me, it's the same thing. She touched it with one finger. I kept it because it was the only thing I had left that was from before. Roman went to the kitchen. He stood at the counter for a few minutes, doing nothing. Then he made 2 cups of tea and brought one to Elara. She held it with both hands without drinking it. Did you know him well? She asked. The boy from that apartment. I knew of him, Roman said, which was the most accurate answer he could give. He was kind, she said. That's what I remember most. He was genuinely kind. I don't think he'd become any of this. She gestured vaguely, meaning the penthouse, meaning the situation they were in. People like that don't usually become this. Roman sat in the chair across from her and looked at her for a long time. He did not tell her who he was that night. He was not ready for what would follow from it, and more practically, he had not yet resolved the situation that made any version of her future stable or safe. But something had shifted in the architecture of how he was thinking about what came next. He had entered the problem of Elias with the mindset of a man protecting his operation. He was now thinking about it differently. In the morning, Roman called a meeting of the 6 captains he trusted most completely. He did not tell them why. He told Tobin to arrange it at a location that Elias's people would not know about, a practice space owned by a musicians' cooperative in the Capitol Hill neighborhood that one of Roman's lieutenants had used for a quiet meeting 2 years earlier. The room was in the basement and had no windows. The 6 men arrived at different times over a 40-minute window. Roman arrived last. He sat at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn before he spoke. I've identified a revenue stream operating inside our infrastructure that I didn't authorize. It's been running for 8 months. The management traces directly to Elias. He paused. The revenue stream is human trafficking. The room was quiet. I need to know if any of you were aware of this, Roman said. He said it without aggression or accusation. He said it as a person asking a factual question. If you were, tell me now. That conversation will be different from the one we'd have otherwise, but it will be better than the alternative. None of them said they were aware. Roman watched their faces as he said it, and he believed them. The surprise in the room was real. Going forward, Roman said, nothing moves through Elias without clearing through me first. I'm telling each of you separately, and I'm telling you not to discuss this with each other until I've made a decision about how to proceed. If Elias asks any of you about irregularities in the terminal operations, you know nothing. He paused. There is one other thing. The federal picture may be changing. I don't know yet in which direction. If any of you receive any contact from law enforcement, I need to know within an hour. Not after you've talked to a lawyer. Within an hour. He looked around the table again. We're going to handle this carefully and we're going to handle it completely. Are there questions? There were no questions. Roman dismissed them in the same staggered sequence they had arrived and left the building through a rear exit that opened onto an alley. Tobin was waiting with the car. The quarterly meeting with Elias, Roman said. Day after tomorrow, Tobin said. I'll be there. Roman got into the car. Between now and then, I want everything Carver's team has turned up compiled into a single document. Hard copy only. Nothing digital? Tobin nodded. Roman looked out the window as the car moved. He was thinking about the two captains that West had named who were Elias's appointments. He was thinking about Caruso, who was not. Caruso was 61 years old and had been in the organization for 22 years. He had survived 3 transitions of power and had always managed to position himself as useful without ever becoming threatening. Roman had kept him on because he was effective, and because removing him would have sent a signal he hadn't wanted to send. Now he was thinking about Caruso differently. He spent the day making calls and receiving reports. By the evening he had a clearer picture of the financial side. Elias had been running the parallel operation out of accounts that Roman had never had visibility into, accounts structured through entities that traced back to a period before Elias joined the organization. This suggested either that Elias had been planning this for a very long time, or that he had inherited the infrastructure from someone and built on it. The second possibility implied a longer history. Roman sat with this for a while. He went to check on Elara in the early evening. She was sitting on the floor of the living area with her back against the couch, and her hands on her knees, her face tilted upward slightly in the way she had when she was thinking. Roman sat on the couch behind her. "Tell me what the network looked like," he said. "The one you were in, where it started." She was quiet for a moment.
Why?
"Because I'm trying to understand something. About the network or about me? Both." She turned her face toward the window. Outside, the city made its constant low sound, traffic and water and the hum of something industrial on the far side of the hill. "I was picked up in Portland," she said. 4 years ago, I was living in a shelter. I had a job, a part-time thing at a food service operation. A woman came to the shelter looking for domestic workers," she said. It sounded legitimate. I had no reason to be careful enough. She paused. It wasn't immediate. They moved carefully. The first place they put me, they let me work for 3 months before the situation changed. Then it changed quickly. By the time I understood what I was in, there was no simple way out. What did the network look like? Who ran it? I only ever saw pieces of it. People were moved frequently. I was in Portland, then somewhere in California I couldn't identify, then Vancouver. Then the container. She paused again. The people who managed the movement were not the same as the people who took the money. It was organized. Not like someone's personal operation. Like a business. Roman said, "Did you hear names? Or places? Anything that connected to Seattle?" She thought about it. There was a man who came to the facility in Vancouver several times. He was American. He spoke with the manager about logistics, about schedules. The other women called him by a name I don't think was real. She paused. He had a way of talking. Very flat. Like everything was already decided. What did he look like? "I can't tell you that," she said quietly. Roman had forgotten for a moment. He felt the familiar weight of his own carelessness with language. "What did he sound like?" He corrected. She described the voice in enough detail that Roman was reasonably certain who it was. The description matched a pattern of speech and a particular flatness of register that belonged to a man he had known for 6 years. He excused himself and went to his study. He sat at his desk with the lights off for 20 minutes. What he was dealing with was no longer simply an unauthorized revenue stream. What he was dealing with was a man who had been building a separate operation inside Roman's structure for at minimum 8 months, possibly much longer, using Roman's infrastructure, Roman's logistics, Roman's terminal access, and Roman's cover to run an enterprise that Roman had explicitly prohibited, while sitting at Roman's table every 2 weeks and presenting accounting reports. The financial damage was real but recoverable. The operational exposure was significant but manageable, if handled quickly. What was neither recoverable nor manageable was the fact that Elias had been present at the quarterly meeting 2 months ago, when Roman had discussed the federal landscape, and had said nothing about the federal exposure his own operation was creating. Roman thought about the fire. He thought about it with more precision than he had in years, because the events of the last several days had cracked open a compartment he had spent a long time keeping sealed. The fire in the Central District had not been investigated as arson. The official record was electrical, a building with outdated wiring and no sprinkler system. Roman had believed for the 15 years since that it had been set by a crew from Tacoma as part of a territorial dispute over the South End freight routes. That belief had never been confirmed. He had acted on it in the first year after the fire, and the Tacoma crew had stopped being a problem. but no one had ever admitted to setting the fire, which was unusual. He picked up the phone and called a man named Garrett who worked in property records and fire investigation documentation and who had done archival research for Roman on 2 previous occasions. The Central District Fire, Roman said. He gave the year, the address, the date. I want everything that exists. Investigation records, witness statements, insurance claims, everything that was filed anywhere. And I want to know who owned the building. Garrett said he would need 48 hours. Roman told him to use 36. The quarterly meeting with Elias took place at the restaurant group's headquarters on Eastlake Avenue, a converted warehouse space that served as both a catering operation and the administrative center for 6 of the organization's restaurant entities. Elias had an office on the 2nd floor. Roman arrived at the building 12 minutes early and did a circuit of the surrounding block on foot, noting the vehicles and the positions of the 2 men Elias kept outside as standard security. He noted the positions but did not alter his approach. He went in through the front. Elias met him at the door of the office. He was a compact man, broad through the shoulders, with gray beginning at his temples. He had a handshake that was firm, without being aggressive, and a habit of brief, direct eye contact that Roman had always read as a sign of someone who had learned to project confidence. He was projecting it now. Good timing, Elias said. The numbers came in better than projected. Walk me through it, Roman said. They sat at the conference table and Elias took him through the quarterly financials for the restaurant group. The numbers were clean and well documented, as they always were. Elias had a precision with financial presentation that Roman had always considered one of his strongest operational qualities. The precision was, Roman now understood, partly a function of the fact that Elias kept his illegitimate revenue entirely separate from the accounts that Roman reviewed. There was nothing in these numbers that would indicate any problem. Roman listened carefully and asked questions that were genuine, focused on a few discrepancies in the food service supply costs that he had noticed in the advance materials. Elias explained them without hesitation. Roman nodded and made notes. Terminal side. Roman said, when the restaurant review was complete, I want to expand the quarterly review to include a more detailed breakdown of the clearance fees by container class. I've been seeing some irregularities in the aggregate numbers. Elias's face did not change. What kind of irregularities? Volume discrepancies against manifest counts. Could be a documentation issue. I want the raw data for the last 6 months by class. I'll have Bellin put that together. Elias said. I want it directly from the terminal records, Roman said. Not filtered through Bellin. Carver can pull it. A very brief pause. Carver reports to Bellin? I know. I'm redirecting that particular request through Carver directly for the next cycle. Elias looked at him for a moment. Is there something specific you're concerned about? I'm concerned about aggregate volume discrepancies, Roman said. Which is what I told you. He held Elias's gaze without any additional signal in either direction. Is there a reason you're asking if there's something specific? No, Elias said. I'll make sure Carver has the access he needs. Roman moved on to the next item on the agenda. The meeting lasted another hour. He left without anything unusual having been said, and he got into the car and told Tobin to drive without specifying a destination. How did he look? Tobin asked. He looked careful, Roman said. Tobin drove in silence for a block. That's worse than nervous. Yes, Roman said. It is. He had the car taken to the Madrona neighborhood, to a house that belonged to no entity with any connection to the organization, registered to a woman who did not exist. It was a property he had been paying property taxes on for 8 years, and he had used it perhaps a dozen times in that period, always as a location for thinking rather than working. He went inside and sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and reviewed what he knew. Elias was not panicking. Elias was managing. That meant either that Elias believed Roman's inquiry into the terminal numbers was routine, or that Elias had known for some time that Roman might eventually look in this direction and had prepared for it. Roman was inclined toward the second interpretation. Careful men prepared. Elias was a careful man. What Elias did not know, as far as Roman could tell, was that Roman had already spoken to Kepler and West. That information had not leaked, because the only people who knew about that conversation were Tobin and the 2 guards who had kept the men contained, all of whom were in Roman's innermost circle, and none of whom had any reason to communicate with Elias. But Roman had to assume that Elias was actively gathering information of his own. He had to assume that Elias had people watching Roman's movements. He had to assume that Elias knew, from the inspection of the container, that Roman had removed a specific person from the captives before handling the situation. He did not know what Elias would make of that, but he had to assume Elias was thinking about it. Roman called Garrett. The building, Garrett said, originally owned by a residential holding company registered in 1999. By the time of the fire, the holding company had been dissolved and the property had been transferred to a sole proprietor. The sole proprietor is listed as one Aaron Crane. He paused. I looked him up. The name appears in organizational records from that period in connection with a freight operation that later became part of the entity that... Elias's father, Roman said. Garrett was quiet. That's what the records suggest. Was there an investigation into arson? The fire marshal's report cited electrical fault. There was no arson investigation. However, the insurance claim was paid within 6 weeks of the fire, which is unusually fast for a property that size. The claim was for full replacement value. The payout went to the sole proprietor's estate. Aaron Crane died 8 months after the fire. Roman put down the glass of water very carefully. Elias Crane. Aaron Crane. Roman had never known Elias's father's name. He had never asked. Elias had never volunteered it, which was not unusual. People in this organization did not discuss their families. Aaron Crane had owned the building. The building had burned. 4 people had died. The insurance had paid out quickly. And Elias, the son of the man who owned the building, had joined Roman's organization 3 years after the fire, presenting himself as a logistics specialist with a background in freight forwarding. Roman sat in the kitchen of the house in Madrona and looked at the wall for a long time. He had made Elias his underboss 4 years after Elias joined the organization. He had done this because Elias had demonstrated consistent competence and because he had never given Roman a reason for suspicion. He was now rereading 6 years of interactions through a completely different frame, and the picture that emerged was of a man who had spent years positioning himself adjacent to Roman's infrastructure with a plan that Roman was only now beginning to see the outline of. The question was what the plan was. The simplest version was that Elias had been running the trafficking operation as a personal revenue stream, using Roman's cover to protect it from external threats, while keeping it hidden from Roman to avoid the prohibition. That was an explanation that fit the evidence. The more complicated version, that Elias had been inside Roman's organization since the beginning with a specific agenda, that the trafficking operation was part of a larger plan to build independent resources, and that the current state of things was preparation for something that had not yet happened. Roman thought about the federal situation. He thought about what Schiff had told him about the expansion of the port review. If someone had been feeding information to federal investigators about Roman's terminal operations, gradually building a case in a way that was timed to Elias's own positioning, then what Roman was looking at was not just internal betrayal. It was a setup. He did not call anyone that night. He went back to the penthouse and sat in his study until after midnight, constructing and dismantling various sequences of events against the evidence he had. At one point he heard Elara moving in the guest suite, and he went to the door of the study and listened, and when the sound settled he went back to the desk. In the morning he had a call with Patricia Howe. He told her nothing about the container or Elias, but he asked her a series of questions about the federal exposure profile of port operations under investigation, and about how quickly an existing investigation could be expanded once a predicate was established. Howe's answers were careful and incomplete, which was how she operated when she suspected she was being given information on a need-to-know basis. Roman accepted this and ended the call. He then called Schiff. The expansion of the port review? Roman said. Who flagged the predicate? I told you I didn't know. I'm asking you to find out. A pause. That's going to require access to materials that are above what our arrangement normally covers. I understand that. Find out anyway. Another pause. It'll take a few days. I have a few days, Roman said. Barely. He spent the remainder of the morning reviewing the hard copy document that Carver's team had compiled. It was 43 pages of shipping records, account traces, and manifest documentation. Roman read it twice. The picture it painted was comprehensive enough that he was reasonably confident he understood the operational structure of Elias's network. What he did not yet understand was the exit strategy. Every operation of this size had an exit strategy built into its architecture. Elias had not built this to run forever inside Roman's infrastructure. He had built it to do something. Roman called Carver. The park connection in Vancouver, Roman said. The logistics company, is it still active? Yes. Running 3 current movements that I can track. Nothing moves through those channels without my authorization from this point. Nothing. If Bellin approves a movement, it doesn't move until I've personally signed off. Bellin is going to push back on that. I know. Let him push. Tell him the authorization requirement is coming from the accounting review. Use that language. And if he goes to Elias about it, "Hey, Will," Roman said. "That's fine." He was not ready to move against Elias directly. Not yet, the timing had to be right, which meant 2 things had to be true simultaneously. Roman needed to have the complete picture, and Elias needed to believe that Roman did not have it. The moment Elias understood that Roman was building a case, Elias would act. Roman needed Elias to believe that the operational friction was routine and that Roman's attention was elsewhere. The operational friction was now Elara. This had become clear to Roman over the preceding days. His absence from several meetings, his redirection of certain operational communications, and the visible alteration of his daily schedule had created a visible gap that people in the organization would notice and read. Elias would notice. Elias would wonder what Roman was protecting so carefully. And if Elias had people watching the penthouse, which Roman had to assume he did, Elias now knew that Roman had taken a specific woman from the container and was keeping her at his residence. Roman could not predict exactly what Elias would make of this, but he could predict that Elias would try to find out who she was. And if Elias found out, the question of what Elara represented to Roman would give Elias information that Roman could not afford him to have. He went to the guest suite. Elara was sitting at the small desk in the corner with her hands flat on the surface, her face tilted upward slightly. She turned when she heard him. "I need to move you," Roman said. "Why?" "Because people are going to start asking questions about you, and I can't answer those questions safely here." She was quiet for a moment. "Where are you moving me?" "A house in a different neighborhood. Smaller, lower profile. Someone will be with you at all times." "Your people?" "My people." She turned this over. "And you trust your people?" "The ones I'm sending with you," he said. She was quiet again. "What's happening?" Roman stood in the doorway. He thought about how much to tell her. He had spent days not telling her things that were relevant to her situation, and the cost of that was that she was navigating a situation without adequate information, which was a disadvantage he had imposed on her for his own reasons. "The person responsible for the operation you were in," he said, "is someone inside my organization. I'm in the process of understanding how deep it goes before I act on it. During that time, you are a potential asset for him to use against me if he finds out I have you here." "Why would he want to use me against you?" Roman chose his words. "Because I reacted to you specifically in a way that was visible. It created the impression that I have a personal interest in what happens to you." "Do you?"
Yes.
She absorbed this. Why? He should have had a prepared answer for this, but he did not. He said, "Because you remind me of someone." It was insufficient. She appeared to know it was insufficient, but she did not push further, which he found, as he had found before, a kind of grace that she had developed over years of limited options and limited information. "All right," she said. "When?" "Tonight. Will you be there?" "Not immediately. Later." She nodded once and turned back to face the wall. Roman arranged the transfer that afternoon. He sent Elara with Tobin and a woman named Mariana, who had been with the organization for 4 years in a support capacity and who Roman trusted specifically because she had no operational loyalty to Elias. The house in Madrona was already prepared. He had Mariana stop at a pharmacy and a grocery store before they arrived. He called ahead to make sure the perimeter was clear. Then he went to a meeting that he had been quietly arranging for 3 days. The meeting was in a conference room at a mid-range hotel in Bellevue, across the water, away from Roman's operational geography. The other person in the room was a federal prosecutor named Chen who worked in the organized crime division of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Chen and Roman had never met before. The introduction had come through a channel that Roman had been maintaining in reserve for years, specifically for a situation like this one. Chen was about 40, careful looking, with the kind of precise attention to words that professional prosecutors developed. He did not offer to shake hands. He sat across from Roman with a notepad and a pen and said, "I understand you have information regarding port operations. I have documentation, Roman said. He placed the hard copy compiled document on the table, 43 pages. Shipping records, account traces, manifest documentation. It traces a human trafficking operation that has been running through my terminal infrastructure for 8 months without my authorization. The operation is managed by my underboss. I can tell you who is in the network, how the money moves, and where the documentation is stored. Chen looked at the document without touching it, and in exchange, immunity for my own operations isn't what I'm asking for, Roman said. I'll take whatever I've earned on the port side. What I want is a specific arrangement. There is a woman who was in the network and is currently in my custody. I want her extracted from the situation legally, with a clean identity, formal witness protection if applicable, and full legal status going forward. That's the condition. Chen was quiet for a moment. You're not negotiating for yourself. I'm negotiating for her. I'll cooperate fully regardless of what you offer me, but I want that condition confirmed in writing before I hand you anything. That's an unusual structure, Chen said. Yes? Roman said. It is. Chen looked at the document again. I'll need to make a call. I'll wait, Roman said. Chen left the room for 12 minutes. When he came back, his expression was neutral in a way that suggested something had shifted. There's an existing file, he said. On the port operations. Not yours specifically, but there's existing material. I know, Roman said. Someone in my organization has been developing a federal relationship. I believe the purpose was to build a case against me as cover for a takeover. I'll give you documentation on that as well. Chen sat back down. Walk me through it. Roman did. The conversation lasted 2 hours. Roman was methodical and complete and answered Chen's questions without hedging. He gave Chen the outline of the trafficking network, the financial structure, the names of the 3 captains and Caruso, the connection to the Vancouver logistics company, and his theory about the federal pipeline. He was careful to separate what he could document from what he had inferred. He did not overstate his certainty on the inferential elements. At the end of the 2 hours, Chen said, "We'll need time to develop the documentation you've provided. I'd estimate 4 to 6 weeks before we're in a position to move." "I don't have 4 to 6 weeks," Roman said. "Elias knows I'm looking at the terminal accounts. When the operational friction I've created makes him uncertain enough, he'll act. I'd estimate 10 to 14 days. Chen looked at him. "How certain are you about the 10 to 14 days?" "I know how he thinks," Roman said. "He will not wait longer than 2 weeks once he's decided I'm onto him." Chen made a note. "Well, accelerate. But I want real-time updates if his behavior changes." Roman gave him a number to reach Tobin, who would relay. He did not give his own number. He left the hotel and sat in the car. Tobin called him as the car crossed the 520 bridge. "Elias's people have been at the penthouse building," Tobin said. 2 men, not the standard security. They were asking questions of the front desk. "What questions?" "About recent guests." The front desk had nothing to give them, but they asked. Roman looked out at the lake. "Where are they now?" "Gone." "But Roman, one of them is Caruso's nephew." Roman thought about this for a moment. "Is Elara settled in Madrona?" "She's in. Mariana has it. Change the access code on the Madrona house. And move the car. I want a different vehicle on her from tonight." A pause. "What's your timeline?" "Shorter than I'd like," Roman said. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled acceleration. He finalized the documentation for Chen, compiled through Carver and his own records. He positioned his 6 most trusted captains on specific tasks, designed to look routine from the outside, but which were in fact consolidating Roman's operational assets in ways that would be useful in a very short period of time. He transferred a significant amount of liquid assets through Patricia Howe's firm into holding structures that Elias had no visibility into. He was not hiding from prosecution. He was making sure that the people he had made promises to, including Elara, were provided for regardless of what happened to him personally. On the 3rd day after the Bellevue meeting, Schiff called. "The person who flagged the predicate for the port review," Schiff said. "It came from a private channel through an attorney contact. The attorney is registered in Washington State. The attorney's client list, as far as I can find it, includes entities that trace back to your organization's structure." Roman said, "Name of the attorney?" Schiff gave it. Roman wrote it down. The name was not Patricia Howe. It was a man named Eckstein, who Roman knew as a contract attorney used occasionally for real estate closings on several of Elias's restaurant entities. He had no relationship with Roman directly. He was Elias's attorney. Elias had initiated the federal investigation himself. Roman sat with this for a long time. The logic of it was clear once he had the information. Elias had been building toward a federal case against Roman's operation, timed to Elias's own consolidation of the trafficking revenue and the independent financial base he had been accumulating. The plan was for Roman to be arrested and prosecuted, for the organization to be in chaos, and for Elias to be positioned as the man who could stabilize it. It was not a plan that Elias had developed recently. The layers of it suggested years of patient construction. Roman felt a cold clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with understanding. He called Chen, the attorney contact who initiated the federal predicate. Roman said, "I can give you documentation that he acted on instruction from Elias Crane, who is the subject of the trafficking investigation you're now building. I can give you the email chain, the financial relationship, and the timeline." Chen was quiet for a moment. "How do you have the email chain?" "I have a long-standing relationship with a data specialist," Roman said. This was accurate. He had a man who had worked for him for 11 years, who had been doing nothing for the last 8 days except working backward through Elias's digital communications. "I'll send it through Tobin's number. This accelerates things significantly," Chen said. "I know," Roman said. "You need to be ready in 7 days." "I'll tell you if we can't make that work," Chen said. Roman put the phone down. He was in the Madrona house by this point, having moved there himself 3 days earlier in order to reduce his visibility at his normal locations. Elara was in the back of the house, and he had spoken to her briefly each day. Short conversations that maintained a kind of equilibrium neither of them named. That evening, sitting in the kitchen after Mariana had gone to sleep, Elara came out and sat at the table. "You're not sleeping?" she said. "No." "How long until whatever is happening resolves?" Roman looked at her. "A week, maybe less." "And then what happens to you?" He was honest. "I'll be arrested. I've arranged a cooperation agreement but will still mean a sentence." She was quiet. "How long?" "I've been told 5 to 7 years with the cooperation credit. The actual outcome will depend on the judge and the specifics." She absorbed this without visible reaction. She had learned to receive difficult information without performance. "You did this on purpose?" she said. "I did this because it was the right structure for the situation?" "No." She tilted her head. "You did this so that I'd be safe afterward. The clean identity. The protection arrangement. You're the one who arranged that?" Roman said nothing. She reached across the table and found his hand, her fingers moving across the back of it until she held it lightly. "The scar on your jaw," she said. "I felt it in the container when you helped me up. I've been trying to decide what to do with it." Roman went very still. "The boy from the apartment had a scar on his jaw," she said. "He got it when he was 14. He told me about it." She paused. "You're not a mid-level captor. You've never been a mid-level anything." Roman looked at their hands on the table. He had spent 15 years constructing a version of himself that did not contain the person she was describing, and here in a house in Madrona with a federal cooperation agreement in process, and Elias Crane making preparations somewhere on the other side of the city, the construction was coming down. "Elara," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "I know who you are." She held his hand and he sat with that for a long time without speaking. Roman spent the next 3 days in a kind of parallel existence. During the day, he maintained his operational routines with the precision of someone who understood that any deviation was legible to people who were watching. He took his scheduled calls. He reviewed the financial reports that came through Patricia Howe's firm. He attended a brief sit-down with 2 of his terminal managers about a procedural change in manifest filing that was entirely legitimate and required no performance on his part. He was present and composed and completely functional, and the only outward sign that anything had changed was that he slept less than 4 hours each night, which was not visible to anyone except himself. At night he sat in the study and mapped the problem with the methodical attention he gave to every problem that mattered. He made lists, not on paper but in the organized structure of his own thinking, working through the sequence of events, the timing, the points at which Elias's construction would have required specific decisions and resources. He was building a picture of Elias's intent the way an investigator builds a picture of a crime, from the physical evidence backward toward the motivation, eliminating the false paths as he went. What he kept arriving at was the question of timing. Elias had been inside the organization for 9 years. If the tenement fire was connected, and Roman was now almost certain it was, then Elias had been running a parallel agenda for the entire duration of his tenure. 9 years of patience. 9 years of positioning. This was not the behavior of an opportunist who had seen an opening and taken it. This was the behavior of someone with a fixed objective and a willingness to invest whatever was required to reach it. The fixed objective, as Roman constructed it, was the organization itself. The trafficking operation was not the goal. It was the funding mechanism for a position from which Elias could take over. The federal pipeline was not an act of desperation or a cover your tracks maneuver. It was the mechanism for the takeover itself. Remove Roman through prosecution, step into the vacuum as the stabilizing figure, and have the financial resources to rebuild under his own control. This was a complete plan. It was a plan that required 9 years to execute. Roman had to respect, in the cold analytical way that he respected any well-constructed system, that Elias had built it carefully. What Elias had not accounted for was the container on Harbor Island. Roman thought about this. The probability that Elias had known Elara was in that specific container. Among the 11 people in a network that moved dozens of individuals per month was low. The trafficking operation was not personal to Elias in that way. It was logistics and revenue. Elara was one unit in a system that Elias managed from a distance through Bellin Park. Elias would have had no reason to know her specific history or her connection to Roman, because that connection existed in a time that predated Elias's entry into Roman's life. Which meant the container was the one element of the situation that had not been calculated. Roman thought about that as well. He spent part of each day reviewing what he knew about Elias's financial picture. The trafficking revenue over 8 months, at the rates he had calculated, was somewhere between $2 and $3 million. That money had gone somewhere. It was not in any account that Carver's team had found. It was not in the restaurant group accounts. Roman had his data specialist working backward through Elias's digital footprint, but the specialist was taking time because Elias was careful. Roman had given Elias enough of his operational thinking over 6 years that Elias had a good model for how Roman approached digital security, and had apparently used that model to structure his own. The data specialist found the first account on the 4th day of looking. It was registered through a nominee in the Cayman Islands, connected to a trust structure that appeared in public records under a name that was not Crane in any variation. The specialist found it by following a pattern in the wire transfer timing that was consistent with how Elias scheduled the restaurant group's vendor payments, suggesting he had used the same scheduling habits for both. Roman looked at the balance in the account when the specialist reported it. It was just under $4 million. $4 million was enough to rebuild a logistics operation from scratch. It was enough to secure the kind of protection that would be necessary in the immediate aftermath of Roman's organization collapsing. It was enough to be comfortable for a long time while the legal situation around the remnants of Roman's enterprise was resolved. It was also, Roman noted, significantly more than the trafficking revenue alone would account for. The additional $2 million had come from somewhere else in the past 9 years. He called Patricia Howe and spent 45 minutes asking her about a series of historical transactions in the restaurant group's capitalization accounts. Howe's answers were precise and careful, but by the end of the conversation Roman had identified 3 instances over 7 years where capital had moved through the restaurant group and into an entity that traced back to the same Cayman trust structure. The amounts were modest individually but added up. Elias had been systematically extracting money from Roman's legitimate businesses for years, in amounts small enough to fall below the threshold that Roman's accounting review would flag. This was patience of a different kind than Roman had appreciated. This was not the patience of someone waiting for a moment. This was the patience of someone building a number, year by year, in the knowledge that the number would be needed. Roman called Chen with the financial documentation. "This extends the scope considerably," Chen said. "I know. I want it included in the full case." "It will be?" Chen paused. "You understand that the more you provide, the more it strengthens your cooperation credit. But it also extends the timeline on the prosecution. More documentation means more investigation?" "I understand," Roman said. "The timeline still has to be 7 days." "I'll do what I can," Chen said. Roman trusted that Chen would do what he said. He had found, in his limited experience with federal prosecutors, that they generally did what they said they would do within the constraints of their own institutional processes. This was one of the reasons he had chosen cooperation over other available paths. The federal process, for all its slowness, was predictable. Roman understood systems, and a predictable system, even an adversarial one, was something he could work with. The days in the Madrona house had a rhythm that Roman did not expect. Elara was present in the kitchen in the mornings and occasionally in the evenings, and they spoke in the way people speak when they are sharing space under circumstances that have removed the usual social scaffolding. They talked about practical things. They talked about the city, occasionally, in ways that allowed Roman to describe what she could not see without it feeling like description for description's sake. Once she asked him about the port, what it looked like at night, and he told her, and the conversation lasted longer than either of them had anticipated. He did not tell her who he was, but she was asking him more questions now, specific questions about his past, about how he had come to run the kind of operation he ran, and the questions had a precision that suggested she was working towards something she already suspected. One morning she asked him directly about the fire. Not what she had experienced, what he had experienced. Roman said, "I lost someone in it. What did you do after?" "I built something that couldn't be destroyed," he said. She thought about this for a while. "That doesn't work," she said. "No, it doesn't." She was quiet. Then she said, "The person you lost. Is that why I'm here?" Roman looked at his coffee. "Partly," he said. "The other part. The other part is that you were in a container in my harbor that someone inside my organization put you in. And I am responsible for what happens inside my operation, including when I didn't know about it." She turned this over carefully. She did this with information the way she moved through an unfamiliar room, using what she could touch and sense to construct a complete picture before she committed to a direction. "That's an unusual kind of responsibility," she said. "It's the only kind I have left," he said. She accepted this. She was very good, he had found, at accepting things that other people would have argued with, not because she lacked the capacity for argument, but because she had an accurate instinct for which arguments were worth the cost. On the morning of the 6th day, Roman woke before 5 and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and went through what was in place. Chen had confirmed that the arrest warrants for Bellin and the 3 captains were prepared and awaiting the signal. The documentation package was complete and delivered. The financial traces were in Chen's hands. The Cayman account information had been passed along through Tobin's number. Patricia Howe, who did not know the full picture but knew enough, had been told to expect a federal contact regarding the restaurant group's records and had been advised, in the understated language that she and Roman used with each other, to cooperate fully. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. What remained was the variable of Elias's timing. Roman had estimated 10 to 14 days from the point when Elias identified the operational friction. He was now at day 8. He had not heard from Elias directly since the quarterly meeting, which was itself a signal. Elias would normally have called 2 or 3 times in the intervening period with routine operational matters. The silence was the sound of someone who had made a decision and was working toward it. Roman finished his coffee and went to check the perimeter. In the early evening of the 6th day, Tobin called to report the visit to the penthouse building. Roman processed this information and gave his instructions, and then sat for a while with the picture it completed. Elias was not going to wait until day 14. He had sent someone to look for information, which meant he was close to the moment of acting. The question was what action he would take first, whether he would move through the federal channel by accelerating whatever material Eckstein had been preparing, or whether he would move directly against Roman in a way that bypassed the institutional process entirely. Roman thought about it and concluded that Elias would do both, sequenced carefully. The federal move would be the primary action, designed to create legal chaos that would distract Roman's remaining loyalists and provide cover. The direct move would come during the chaos, in a form that could be attributed to the general disorder of an organization under federal pressure. This was how Roman would have done it. He had, over the years, taught Elias a great deal about how he thought. He called Chen that evening and gave him the assessment. Chen listened and said he would make the morning call to the magistrate. Roman said tomorrow was the day. He went to Elara's room and told her she was moving, On the 6th day, Elias moved. Roman knew it was coming because Carver called at 6 in the morning to report that Bellin had attempted to access the terminal records through an emergency authorization protocol that bypassed the new reporting structure Roman had imposed. The attempt had been blocked, but it told Roman that Elias's information was current. Someone had told him about the documentation block. Roman spent the next hour calling his 6 captains. 2 of them did not answer. One called back 40 minutes later with a story about his phone being in another room that was not convincing. He called Chen. "Today," Roman said. "We're not fully positioned," Chen said. "Then get partially positioned and work with what you have." "He's moving today?" A pause. "What's his move?" "I don't know yet. Could be the police. Could be direct. He has 3 people he can use for direct action." Roman paused. "The arrest I agreed to cooperate on. Start with Bellin. Bellin is the operational link. If you take Bellin today, you cut Elias's communication with the terminal network." "I'll make the call," Chen said. "But Roman, if we're going today, I need you to stay accessible. Don't disappear." "I won't," Roman said. He called Tobin. "Get Mariana and Elara out of the Madrona house. Not to the penthouse. The address I gave you in Renton." He paused. "Tobin, don't come back after you drop them." "What do you mean?" "I mean stay with them. Whatever happens today, stay with them until Chen's people make contact." A longer pause. "Roman, go," Roman said. He sat in the kitchen alone for a while. Then he went to Elara's room and knocked. She opened it. "You're being moved again?" he said. "Is it today?" she asked. "Wes." She reached out and found his arm. She held it for a moment, not tightly. "Be careful," she said. It was a simple thing to say, and she said it as if she meant it with the weight of the specific. Roman said, "I will be." He was lying and she probably knew it. The federal arrest began at 11 that morning. Bellin was taken at his office on the waterfront. 3 captains were taken simultaneously at locations that Roman had specified in the documentation. Eckstein, the attorney, was taken at his office in Pioneer Square. The warrants had been issued on an expedited basis through a federal magistrate who had been handling organized crime cases for 17 years, and who moved quickly when the documentation was sufficient. Roman was watching the operation from a position he had taken at a parking structure on 2nd Avenue, from which he could see the federal vehicles staging in the blocks around the terminal area. He had a phone and a cup of coffee. He was waiting for Elias. Elias called him at 11:40. "There are federal vehicles at the Eastlake building," Elias said. His voice was controlled. "I can see that," Roman said. A pause. "What did you do?" "I gave them Bellin," Roman said. "I gave them the trafficking network documentation. I gave them your attorney and the file he sent to the federal contact." Silence. "You were going to give me to them," Roman said. "You were building the case for 3 years. The fire in the Central District 15 years ago. Your father owned the building. Elara was in that building." He kept his voice level. "You've been inside my organization since the year after the fire. I've spent a long time not asking why." Elias said nothing for several seconds. When he spoke, his voice had changed in a small way that Roman noticed. "You can't prove the fire." "I don't need to prove the fire," Roman said. "The federal case covers enough. The fire is something I needed to understand for myself." Another silence. "Where are you?" Elias said. "I'm where I said I'd be," Roman said. "Standing in what's left of what I built. You should surrender to the federal agents at the Eastlake building. They know where you are." "Roman, this is over?" "Elias. Everything I had is either dismantled or in federal custody. You don't have anything left to take." He paused. "Go to the agents." He ended the call. Elias did not go to the agents. He attempted to leave Seattle by ground, taking a vehicle to a connection point in Tacoma, from which he had apparently planned to move toward Portland. The federal team was aware of the vehicle, because Roman had provided the registration and Elias's likely exit routes as part of the cooperation documentation 2 days earlier. He was stopped on Interstate 5 near Fife at approximately 2 in the afternoon. Roman was arrested at the parking structure at 12:15. When a federal agent he recognized from the container terminal oversight operation came to him with 2 colleagues and a warrant, he got into the federal vehicle without resistance. The processing took most of the afternoon. Roman was held overnight and appeared before a federal magistrate the following morning. Chen was present. The cooperation agreement was formalized in a document that Roman's temporary court appointed counsel reviewed and approved. The terms included Roman's full testimony against Elias Crane and the trafficking network, delivery of all remaining encrypted documentation, and cooperation with the dismantling of the port logistics operation. In exchange, Roman received a formal plea agreement on 3 federal counts with a sentencing recommendation of 5 to 7 years, with credit for cooperation. The federal case against Elias Crane expanded over the following months to include the trafficking counts, the attempted manipulation of the federal investigation, and a set of financial fraud charges connected to the Vancouver logistics infrastructure. The fire investigation was reopened by the King County Cold Case Unit based on documentation that Roman provided through Chen. The unit was unable to build a criminal case on the fire itself due to the age of the evidence and the death of the primary witnesses, but the investigation's findings were entered into the federal record as background. Elias received 22 years. The Seattle syndicate did not survive Roman's cooperation. The dismantling of the terminal logistics infrastructure took approximately 8 months, as federal investigators worked through the layered documentation that Roman had provided. The organization's revenue streams collapsed sequentially, first the terminal network, then the money laundering entities as the restaurant group's financing was unwound, then the extortion operations as the captains either accepted deals or were prosecuted. Of the 17 captains, 11 were eventually charged. Caruso accepted a deal and received 18 months. 2 captains disappeared and were never found. Patricia Howe was not charged. Her cooperation with Roman's entities had always been legally insulated by design, and she knew it. She continued practicing law. Carver was given a federal immunity arrangement in exchange for his testimony and cooperation with the terminal documentation process. He kept his job at the port. Roman had insisted on this as part of the cooperation terms, and Chen had agreed. Roman was sentenced 5 months after his arrest. The federal judge sentenced him to 6 years, the lower end of the recommendation range, and made note in the sentencing statement of the specific nature of the cooperation and the particular circumstances of the case. Roman was transported to a federal correctional facility in Sheridan, Oregon, where he served the sentence in full without incident. Elara was given a new identity, legal status, and a federal relocation assistance arrangement that included housing support and vocational training. The arrangement was one of the specific conditions that Roman had insisted upon before any other term was discussed, and Chen had honored it without modification. She was established in a city on the other side of the country, in a situation that was safe and ordinary in hers. Tobin, who had followed Roman's instruction to stay with her until the federal contact was established, had helped with the practical aspects of the move. He then came back to Seattle, where he spent a period of considerable difficulty navigating a city whose operational structure had entirely changed, and eventually found legitimate employment in maritime logistics, which he was qualified for. Mariana did the same. Roman was released in the spring of the 5th year, receiving time credit for behavior and his extensive cooperation. He was 53 years old at his release date. The Oregon facility had a processing procedure that involved returning a man's personal effects in a paper envelope. And the paper envelope that Roman received contained a watch, a wallet with $40 in it, and a phone that no longer held any charge. He put on the watch and put the wallet and the dead phone in his jacket pocket, and walked through the processing gate into the morning. The parking lot outside the Sheridan facility was small and mostly empty at the hour of his release. There was a rental car in the visitor section, an ordinary mid-sized sedan in a shade of gray that was common. A woman was standing beside it. She was wearing a coat against the spring cold, and she had her face turned in the general direction of the processing gate, which was where she had heard the doors open. Roman stood for a moment and looked at her. She had asked Tobin to bring her. She had, in the years since the federal arrangements were made, rebuilt a version of life that was functional and in some ways more complete than the version she had lived before the fire. She had friends. She had work. She had a specific and hard, one understanding of her own capability. She had kept the locket. Roman crossed the parking lot. When he was close enough, she heard his footsteps and extended her hand. He took it. She held it the same way she had held it at the kitchen table in the Madrona house, not tightly, the way of someone who was not afraid of the thing that she was holding. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You're thinner," she said. "5 years of federal food," he said. She held his hand, and they stood in the parking lot while the spring morning went on around them, ordinary and clear. The sound of the highway in the distance, and nothing else remarkable about any of it. Roman looked at her face, at the locket at her throat, at the small mundane facts of the life she had made, and he understood that he had nothing now except this, and that this was considerably more than he deserved, and that he would not waste it. They got into the car. She handed him the keys. He drove,